Well, welcome everybody who's here and joining us here at the virtual Kelly Writers House, which is another way of saying that we're home. And this may be hopefully one of the last times we need to do it this way, with all of us slowly getting back to normal. I'm Dick Polman, you might see on the screen, and my guest here, Bob Strauss, and from his home in Jersey, and I'm in Philadelphia. As advertised, we're here to talk about Bob's new book about John Marshall, our first great Supreme Court justice, but many other things in his life. John Marshall, the final founder. That's Bob's new book. As some of you may know, he's taught many years at University of Pennsylvania, journalism, nonfiction writing, I should say. And has been a very frequent freelancer, most notably for the New York Times. His previous book was about the President James Buchanan, and it was called Worst President Ever, with period marks after each of those three words, which I think is very contemporary, Bob. And we're going to talk here about Mr. Marshall, and also try to sort of maybe put him in some kind of a contemporary context as well as we go. So all of you who may be watching and listening may not just think we're talking about, another dead white guy. But before we start on Marshall, Bob, I wanted to ask you, given what we've seen the last 4 years, I have a feeling that we need to answer the question, is James Buchanan, in your mind, still the worst president ever?
Well, I got a call, well, it was an email, a few weeks ago from Sarah Lyle of the New York Times, and she says, "Are you the Robert Strauss who wrote Worst President Ever?" By the way, my editor thought of the title, and when he gave it to me, I thought, "Oh, how juvenile," And then, of course, it was perfect because nobody, there were several people who interviewed me who didn't have to read the book because they could just chat about worst presidents. But in any case, anyway, she was doing a story, and it ran a couple of weeks ago on, whether Trump was worse and she interviewed, famous historians, Darskins, Goodwin, anyway, several other, and they all sort of made the case for Trump. And of course, at the end, I was the counterpoint, sticking up for my guy, such as it was. And I tried to be a little lighter because they were so, tense about whether that was the right thing to say. But I still go back to, he always has the trump card in that he allowed secession and basically started the Civil War. Now, there are many other things about Buchanan that I could go on, but one of the things that I think people, had they known or read about Buchanan, is that he was a really nice guy. He was just a bad president. He couldn't make decisions and all this sort of, and at a time when, the president's got to make decisions. And I sort of paint it as that, like, I'm sure you have a best friend, but you wouldn't want to see him play second base for the Phillies. You know what I mean? It's like he didn't have the skill to become president. So I'm sticking with my guy, and there you go.
Well, I unlike our most recent departing president, at least he did go to the inauguration of his successor.
That guy, right. And of course, you could also make the case that Lincoln was the worst president because he should have let those people secede and have their own country, and we wouldn't be bothered by anything. We wouldn't have Donald Trump as president. They done that.
He might have run for president of that particular country. It might have been
whatever that country would have been, right?
He would have won 2 popular votes in a row instead of 2 being defeated.
That's right.
Well, all right. So about Marshall, let me just ask you a broad overview question first to sort of set our context, and you could take this whichever direction you think you need to. Which is basically, why is John Marshall, who was, the first consequential Supreme Court justice and served till 1835 when he died in office.
Philadelphia.
Excuse me? In Philadelphia, where where he came here for treatment, right? On horseback at the end.
Yes. I think he came in a carriage, but still,
All right, a horse.
The road up was
Why is he so? Why do you think he's historically so important, and in what ways do you think his story resonates today?
Okay, so well, I'll answer the second one first. Why does the story of Hamilton, meaning the musical Hamilton, is a good example of what I feel is missing in history a bit. Often history is dry. History has become a less popular major in college, probably because of that. Some of it is, of course, people think that they have to have a business degree to have a job, but nonetheless. You have the sort of the Ken Burns angle of history, which is fine, but not everybody can do that in a class. So we've done fewer and fewer courses, I think, or we view history as some sort of recitation of facts, as opposed to looking at a person or stories around history. And I really sort of love doing that. And I felt that Marshall was another one of those guys, like the Hamilton, who was, had like a long resume and was a person of both substance and interest. I mean, for instance, and he fits into this era that we sort of view as some sacrosanct time, the founders, the founding fathers. They're always alluded to, the founding fathers. Well, it really was a pretty loosey-goosey type of thing. I mean, and so to get to the other point, why is he consequential? Well, he took this thing, the courts are not very mentioned very specifically in the Constitution, but he took upon himself this thing, and that is to moderate between the two other branches and made the courts a co-equal branch. Not exactly right after the Constitution, but close enough. And that's sort of how our country came to be. I mean, who knew how to be a president? Well, Washington knew how to be a president, right? We could have had somebody else. And so he did all those things that started being a president. So what Marshall did all these things that made the Supreme Court up. Anyway, so that's why he is significant. And what Marshall did is what we sort of go by today.
Well, I was curious because I recently was rewatching, just coincidentally, HBO's series on John Adams.
Yeah, I did too. Yeah,
and because I'm kind of a junkie for that stuff, and I went to see Hamilton, like any good American, and so I keep thinking, here's an HBO series on Adams and a musical theater on Hamilton, and why hasn't anybody latched on to Marshall?
Well, Hamilton's sort of lucky because mostly they latched onto the presidents, the people who became president. Now, I mean, Gore Vidal long ago wrote a sort of cynical biography of Aaron Burr, but that's a long time ago. And, nobody's done, I don't know, Robert Morris either, like other people who were significant at that time. But Marshall, I felt, had this sort of other life. I mean, look, for instance, this is the kind of thing that I like to tell. So he was at Valley Forge. His father was sort of friends with Washington. And, he follows his father into war and he gets to Valley Forge and he's sort of a junior officer. But what he took upon himself was to cheer up the other people there. And he became sort of the athletic director. And, he would have races. I mean, we also glamorized Valley Forge as someplace where everybody was wearing no shoes and falling over and becoming iced over themselves. Well, there were only 12,000 people there. I mean, yes, some people died. Most of the people who died of disease in March, April, and May. So in other words, they made it through the winter, but the disease sort of took them out then. But if so many people died, we wouldn't have had a revolution, right? I mean, this was the army. And if thousands of people had died at Valley Forge, it wouldn't have lasted very long. But in any case, so Marshall, one of the things that one of the diaries said is that he could jump over a bar that was placed on the heads of two soldiers. Well, that's pretty good, like 6 feet. I mean, it's not a world record, but it's sort of a little Pennsylvania War Olympics kind of thing. And he ran in his stocking feet, and so they called him Silver Heels. And so he had this sort of panache even as a young officer. So that doesn't quite square with, but many of his things don't quite square with this sort of state Supreme Court Chief Justice. Another thing he did is that he didn't go to school. He went to 1 year of school, boarding school in Virginia, where he met James Monroe. They all knew each other, right? And then he went to like 5 seconds of law school at William and Mary, and he left when his girlfriend moved to Richmond with her family. And so here we have this sort of when you go to the Supreme Court in Washington, there's a big statue of him, and he's really venerated there. He is really the guy, and yet he didn't even go to school. Basically, didn't go to school. So this is a whole different aspect of the founding fathers that I sort of found interesting. And let me just say that it wasn't that hard to be a founding father. You know what I mean? You and I could have been founding fathers. Just think of it. Okay, so there's 1790 census has 3.5 million people, or 3 point something million people, not 4. And, many of them are women, so that doesn't matter, right? They can't do anything. Many of them are Black, either free or slaves. Many of them are 12 years old or 4 years old or however old they can't be yet. So there's 800,000 white men over 16. Well, that really isn't that many, right? About 800,000. I mean, I don't know. It's twice the size of Newark or half the size of Philadelphia, right? So if you think about half the size of Philadelphia, they all could have been founding fathers. So then there are other people who just wanted to live out in the countryside, so they don't count. So for instance, okay, so Marshall comes back from the war, and he comes to Williamsburg, Virginia, because his father got a job there. And when he comes into town, this one family has 3 girls, much like in Hamilton, right? And they decide that they should have a party for this new soldier. And the youngest girl decides, he's going to be mine. I'm going to go after this guy. And he comes in, and he's sort of shaggy, and he's just a sort of an ex-soldier from Western Virginia, and he's so shy. And so the other girls sort of aren't interested in him anyway. And the other girl who's interested in him is 13 years old, right? 13 years old. When you think about these founding fathers, John Adams, Abigail was 15 when they started going out. And Jefferson, has his mulatto slave, whatever you want to call her, not wife, and she's 14 when they start going out. It's a different kind of era. Anyway, so Marshall just becomes smitten with her. And when he's going to this law school, they have his law notes, and all over them, it's just like junior high girls. It's like Polly and John, PANJM, all these kinds of things on his notes. Well, her father gets this job. Her father gets this job in Richmond. So he says, all right, I'm going to Richmond. And he goes to Richmond, And the way he gets his law degree is that the governor gives him his degree, and that's Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson is his second cousin, and they don't yet hate each other, because they do have a great hate, and that goes to the beginning of our country. But in any case, so he goes up to Richmond, he becomes a lawyer, and he becomes sort of the best lawyer in Richmond after a while. Well, big deal. Richmond's got 2,600 people. How hard is it to be that? And so he moves up the chain, and becomes a founder, because he just sort of is in that chain. He's not in the farmer chain. He's not in the businessman chain. He's in the politician chain. So all these guys, they do know each other. I mean, they come here to Philadelphia, right? I know I'm rambling a bit, but it's just the way I like to tell history. So for instance, Aaron Burr set up James and Dolly Madison. So, Burr and Madison are sort of friends, and Philadelphia's not that big. It only goes out to 7th Street, from the river. And so they're standing around apparently, and Dolly Madison is this young widow. Her first husband died in the epidemic, the smallpox epidemic, and Madison's sort of looking at her, and Burr says, "Well, are you interested in her?" And he says, Madison's short, squirrely guy, right? He says, "Well, I guess, I don't know." And Burr says, "Well, I know her." Says, "I used to board in her father's rooming house, so I can set you up." And I mean, I'm putting modern words in their mind. That's what happens. So like I said, all these people knew each other. All these people sort of got together or were enemies in some way. And in addition to being Marshall's second cousin, Jefferson was also one of Jefferson's loves, who he proposed to, and she rejected him, married his father-in-law. In other words, was his mother-in-law. So, another sort of strange connection. But in any case, Marshall then becomes a rather significant figure. In short terms, he is the leader of the Virginia Federalists, which was a smaller group, but it got Virginia to ratify the Constitution, which was, it had to be, because Virginia was the biggest state. If it didn't go along, it doesn't matter whether the other 12 would have gone along. And he did some foreign service. There's a thing called the XYZ affair, which was actually a question and answer in Final Jeopardy 3 weeks ago. I sort of felt it was karma. My book is coming out, and there's John Marshall in the answer. Anyway, the XYZ affair was without getting too far into it, it was the French wanted bribes to be paid in order to have a treaty with America, and Marshall refused to do it, and he became a hero for solving this, rejecting this, not giving money away to the French. And then he was a congressman. He was a Washington acolyte. He was Washington's biggest acolyte, really. And he eventually wrote the first biography of Washington. Anyway, so I'm going on a bit, but he became Secretary of State and then Chief Justice. And there's funny stories around that would tell you something about our era. Well, anyway, go on and you direct me in a certain way.
Well, all right, we'll get back to what you think it tells us about our era. I'll put that away for a second. I mean, the whole way you were explaining all this was obviously that in very human terms. These people were not they may look like they're all chiseled in stone today and that they lived that way, but they weren't. There was no guaranteed outcome of how the country was founded, and these are real flesh and blood people with all the same flaws that all human beings have. But there was one line you had early on in the book, I think it might have been in the preface, about how you look at history, and you were talking about how you do it. You like to this is a quote from you. You like to to smile at the wonder of it all. And, and that tone, which I think, is threaded throughout the book, is also kind of the way you were just talking about it. When you just think of all these, like these very human connections and very human behaviors. And I guess you kind of answered one of the questions that I had, which was basically, what about John Marshall makes you smile the most? I don't know, maybe hurdling that bar at Valley Forge in his stocking feet qualifies.
It's funny how there's the other thing in the book I talk about myths and there's a couple of myths around John Marshall having to do with Philadelphia, actually. The final myth is that he died at Pennsylvania Hospital, getting his kidney stones taken out, and of course they bled him. So who knows whether he would have survived. One of the things is he had three sons and two sons there, and a third one was coming to meet him. And the day before he died, the son was in Baltimore, and the part of a building fell on him and killed him. So sort of a tragedy on tragedies. But in any case, the myth is that the Liberty Bell rang for the last time, tolling the death of John Marshall, okay, and cracked, and it never tolled again. Well, 0 for 3. It didn't ring because the State House bell wasn't made like that. It wasn't made for doing that. There are some church bells that probably did. He was he was a Chief Justice, and he'd been there for a long time. He died in Philadelphia. Philadelphia's not that big. So that didn't happen. And of course, it had been cracked long before, and so it didn't crack anymore. So because it didn't toll, and finally it did toll in other times. The Liberty Bell was taken around the country several times after that. But the importance of that is that we had these men who were to most people they'd never seen them. They only know their stories. There's a story about another story about the Marshall is that, and it's very appropriate till now, is that he wanted to be vaccinated from smallpox.
Yeah, right.
And so he's in Richmond, and one of the things he had to do, Virginia made them do, it's like you would do here if you wanted to have a swimming pool, is they had to get all the neighbors to sign off on it. Because they would be worried that they would get smallpox from this guy who got vaccinated with the live vaccine. So he found out that in Philadelphia, libertine city that it was, you could get a vaccination. I'm sure that people now are worried about their vaccinations. But so the legend is that he walked to Philadelphia, right? Well, and he made it in less than a week. Well, that would be not very easy today with roads, but there are no roads, at this time. Nobody's taking I-95 from Richmond to Philly. But nonetheless, the story is that he comes to this inn and they won't let him in because he's got a beard like Dick Polman's beard, probably because it was only a week. But in any case, and he doesn't get admitted. And then later on, when he's a congressman, he comes in, he says, "Remember me." And of course, they like him now because he's cleaned up and a congressman. But in any case, these are stories they like to tell. I'm just listening in the car to Joseph Ellis's book on the Adamses' letters to each other. And one of the things is that Mrs. Adams, Abigail, had some letters to Jefferson, and they were talking about the British press. You can't trust the British press. They're telling stories that Ben Franklin went home and was stoned to death. So how much different? How much different do we live our lives? It's just that we're taught that these people were so, I don't know, like you said, etched in stone in some way.
Well, yeah. I mean, don't we need, I have to confess that for years, all I knew about John Marshall were two things. One, that Marbury versus Madison, the most consequential. We'll talk a little bit about that. Supreme Court decision. I knew that. And what I knew, or thought I knew, was that the Liberty Bell cracked after he died. I mean, I had heard that growing up. And
yeah, but yeah, that's right. And this, but I went to the, whoever is the historian there, and he said that just didn't happen. You wouldn't have done it. Just the bill is too big, and you'd have to like arrange it in a different way than it was then, and it was sort of precariously in the upper part of the of Independence Hall, or what we call Independence Hall now, the State House, which was almost demolished to make way for who knows what, senior housing, I don't know, and because it was a building that was old at that point for them.
Yeah,
falling apart.
Well, I guess we just, all I can conclude from that is that one of the things that's universal here is that, every nation needs its myths. When I was a foreign correspondent, I used to do stories in France, and they were all convinced there that during World War II, everybody was in the resistance. And they hated being reminded that it wasn't true. And, so this whole idea about, the Liberty Bell, I mean, that's just a classic example. Also, I think one of the other ones is, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit, was how when we look back at the founding fathers and all the paintings and stuff, that, that this was like all this grand high road, bipartisan, nonpartisan effort to get the country started. And whereas what you reminded us of, and I have a quote here from page 125, where you say, those who think that the modern day tweet storms are disturbing and even vicious would be wise to consult history. And, I was reminded in your book about how vicious, you're talking about the great hate between Jefferson and Marshall, how vicious some of the early politicking was between the Federalists and what were then called the Republicans. And how Marshall was all in the middle of that. Maybe he wasn't one of the big instigators, because I think you see he was kind of a bit of a moderating force.
Yeah, I do a bit.
But he was, he was pinned between these different factions. So, for anybody who might be watching this, who thinks that our politics today are just, impossible to take, what would be a perfectly instructive anecdote or example of what happened in and around 1800 that really puts this in perspective, that puts today in perspective?
Right. Okay. So there's a couple of things. One is the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Right.
Marshall doesn't have all that much to do with, except that he was elected to Congress and he said he would not vote for them again. But what happened was that the Adams people, the Federalists and Adams himself, passed these laws that basically said you couldn't say anything bad about the government. They jailed the congressman. They jailed the newspaper editors for just writing, the same. They didn't have to be Tucker Carlson. They could have been the Philadelphia Inquirer, sort of mildly against the government. So that was a little crazy, and certainly didn't endear the two parties to come together as they had under Washington. I mean, Washington was sort of the sort of father figure that allowed them to argue without killing each other. But in Marshall's case, just before the takeover from the Republicans, having won with Jefferson and Adams still there was a case called, they call it the Midnight Judges. The Federalists had everything. They had the Congress, both houses of Congress and the presidency, but they were going to lose everything in the next session. So they passed 58 judges. They nominated and confirmed 58 judges. Now think about how small the country was. This went down to justice of the peace. And one of those justices of the peace was this guy, William Marbury, who he was sort of an operator. he didn't do anything illegal, but he was always trying to get this job or this contract, and he was able to do it through his various influence. And he wanted to be a justice of the peace in Washington. He lived in Alexandria, which was not Alexandria that we know now, but part of Alexandria that became part of Washington, D.C., which, remember, only became the capital in 1800. And so Marshall was one of these, was the Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time, but he was also Secretary of State. Now, imagine that. Imagine, Donald Trump could have made, in this scenario, John Roberts Secretary of State too. Well, it's something we don't imagine at the time. But in any case, as Secretary of State, Secretary of State Marshall had to sign off on these appointments, one of which was Marbury's. Anyway, there's this sort of myth that somebody from Jefferson's cabinet or appointees or friends is standing there with a watch as Marshall is signing these things the day before, the night before, midnight on March 4th. Sorry, get out of the office. You can't be there anymore. Anyway, so he's sending them out. They're sending them out. One of the couriers happens to be his brother. That's not really that relevant. But in any case, Marbury doesn't get his. And I think there are three other people besides Marbury, but Marbury's the point man who really wants this job. Now, there are three justices of the peace in Washington. How many people could have lived in Washington? The city was only a year old. 1,000 people. I don't know how many people were living there then. So how many judges did you need except the Federalists wanted to fill it all up? Now, we talk about Amy Barrett becoming this, making the court so conservative. Well, think about March 4th, 1801, and however many judges they put in and how many other judges were before. Every judge in the United States, every federal judge in the United States was a Federalist. In this administration now, it's all Republican. So, you think we have this faction that doesn't like each other in Washington now between the Supreme Court and the current administration. Well, it was lopsided. And the other thing the Federalists did is they passed a law saying that the court would go down from 6 people, there were 6 people on the court, an even number, to 5. In other words, the next person that quit or died wouldn't be replaced. So the Republicans wouldn't even get to put that person in. So then, of course, Marshall is this Federalist, and Jefferson and his people are Republicans. Marshall gets, the Supreme Court hadn't decided very many cases because there weren't that many cases to decide. So it was looked at a lesser place. In fact, Congress put it in the basement. It had a basement room in the Capitol, which on some weekends became the place where the formal dances were in Washington. This is the kind of place, this is our nation's capital. Actually, Marshall built, he was supervised the building of the Capitol and the White House and several other smaller federal buildings, because Adams, when he first came in, it gets to be sort of about April or May, and it's too hot for him. He's from Massachusetts. He can barely stand the weather in Philadelphia, and he can't stand it in Washington, which is sort of built on a swamp. And he says, I'm leaving, Marshall, you take over. So Marshall was the supervisor of building that. He was probably the first person to sleep in the White House because there was no tavern room for him, or at least a nice enough one. So he just slept in the construction. Can you imagine that? John Roberts sleeping in the building of some high rise and by the stadium or something. He then starts making the Supreme Court into something. And what that something comes around is this case, Marbury versus Madison. So Marbury is suing in court. Madison isn't giving him his commission. Enough already, Madison is saying, or Jefferson is saying. Madison is the Secretary of State. Now, one thing you also have to remember is that it was Marshall's fault that Marbury did not get his commission on time. So the greatest case in the Supreme Court is a conflict of interest. Like he's deciding this case that it's his problem, except that he decides it in a very convoluted manner. And what Marshall's thing was, he would always try to give a sop to the other side. So the sop he gives to the other side is that Marbury's commission isn't any good. It didn't come out on time. A simple case. But the major thing in this decision is that he then says, but the Judiciary Act of 1789 is null and void because it doesn't jive with the Constitution, and so therefore, even though Marbury doesn't get his say, the Supreme Court can review federal laws, and if they don't jive with the Constitution, they can be overturned. And that was something that was unexpected. It's not in the Constitution. It's only because Marshall said it's there. And the Jeffersonians were stymied because in order to go against it, they'd have to give up something. And so they figured, okay, this won't happen very much. Well, it's only happened for 200 years since then,
Yeah, because I was going to ask you if it was so if it was so new, and it wasn't in the Constitution that the Supreme Court could technically do that. I was going to ask you, why didn't the Jefferson people just like defy it, or.
Well, here for a couple of reasons. One is that the Supreme Court. Well, Marshall had this conflict. Well, so did John Jay, the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. He went off and Washington sent him off to do a treaty, the treaty with Britain to sort of wind up things at the end of the war. Well, I mean, you can't be part of the executive branch and the judiciary today, but he's off there in England. The third Supreme Court Chief Justice did the same thing. They sent him off to France to sort of settle the Barbary Pirates War. So the Supreme Court really didn't do very much. So the Jeffersonians weren't very upset about it.
I see. They thought this was an exception, huh?
Yeah, this is just this case. I mean, who cares about, this justice of the peace anyway, and this review is just Marshall getting back at our side. And he's sitting there, the case is finally heard in part in the tavern where Marshall has all the other justices living, and one of them has the gout and can't get over to the Capitol, and so they have it in the drawing room of the tavern because that's how we could have a quorum. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's like are they going to go to the Sheraton City line and have the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decide some case there? And all the other succeeding cases that are famous in the Supreme Court build on this. It's that the federal government has a say. The federal government has a reason to be. And if that didn't happen, this country really would have splintered because there would have been constant arguments between the
Executive
and the Congress and the president about who had sovereignty, and it just people. I would say that we would have the Confederation again. We would have 13 colonies or 13 states bound by some peace treaty or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the way we look at history. Well, let me ask you this question about how we look at history today through today's lens.
Right.
What would you say to? I'm not saying anybody's saying this, but this would not surprise me. What would you say to anyone who might argue, who might want to dismiss Marshall by saying, well, he owned slaves, just like they all own slaves.
Right.
Washington owned slaves. All the founders owned slaves. Jefferson, needless, like you just mentioned, Marshall owned slaves too. So, I'm sure there are some people, perhaps even in the academic world, who might say, well, these old white guys were all racists. Why do we even honor them, even to the facts that you've put together here?
Yeah, well, I would say that life is beautiful. I mean, you look at technology. I mean, did you even know about Zoom a year and a half ago? And everybody's using it, right? Yeah. I mean, women didn't vote either. I mean, we mostly in this sort of I don't want to use the word cancel culture, but I can't think of a word about it. But whatever.
I'm trying to avoid it myself.
Yeah, whatever this thing is, mostly is about slavery, right? It's about or racism, but they were misogynists too. I mean, they gave bribes. There are things that they did. They were on both sides of the same issue, like Marshall, like Jay, so they did all these sorts of things. So we're now holding them to this slave kind of thing, and it's very hard to think of. We all lived. I mean, we have friends who grew up in the South who are our age. That meant that they went to segregated schools. Would they be canceled out by for their job now because they went to segregated schools, or they lived in a state that wouldn't allow interracial marriage, or we all live in states that had something that was anti-gay. So should we be subjected to that? The thing I believe about the whole slavery issue is that we should educate people. You can take down the statue or not, but you really should have some sort of educational thing saying this is the way it was, and it's not the way we want it now. We don't believe in this, but in 1843, this is the way the country was. I mean, we all know that Lincoln did not think Black people were the equal of white people. So, it's too hard to just, well, excuse me, it's too easy to pick slavery as your one, cutting point. There are many other things that these people were and weren't that just don't jive with modern society.
Yeah,
the way we want modern society to be.
Yeah, because I've been watching this. CNN has had this really interesting documentary series on Lincoln,
right?
Which I think they had the 5th or 6th episode the other night, and I think they've been handling it, the slavery issue and Lincoln and his views on race. I think they were handling it sort of along the lines of what you were just talking about. They're basically saying, all right, let's honor Lincoln for the stuff he did that really, was strong and that we can really get with today. But by the same token, they're not hiding the fact that, he didn't think that Blacks could live on an equal basis with whites. He didn't necessarily think they were equal to whites. He wanted to have them colonized and, somewhere else on an island somewhere. And, his thinking evolved. But they're very straightforward about what his views were originally in the context of the time that he lived, sort of just putting it all out there in all its complexity. So I guess that's, and you noted in the book, that Marshall said, well, I don't know if he owned a lot of slaves or what, if the number matters to you or
well, isn't one enough? I mean, right. But in the Supreme Court context, Marshall wanted all of the decisions to be unanimous, and it wasn't that they were unanimous. It was like if there were 7, well, initially there were 5 justices. If it was 3-2 one way, we would all sign off on it. We know that it's 3-2 this way, but for us, we want one voice. And next time it'll be 3-2 the other way. And Marshall wrote most of his, he wrote all of his major decisions and many of the others. But to bring it somewhat more modern, So Earl Warren was the Attorney General who stuck all the Japanese in the internment camps in California, right? So then Earl Warren becomes this great saint after he presides over Brown versus Board of Education, and he wants it to be unanimous because he feels that that's the only way it'll work. So there's a man that was involved with two of the major cases, probably the best case and one of the worst cases, on either side of it. And as the Supreme Court Chief Justice, or even as an Associate Justice, you got a lifetime appointment. You got nobody to impress anymore, except each other, right? And think about it, like the current Supreme Court, well, until Amy got on, was all Harvard and Yale graduates of some sort, either law school or undergraduate, if Ginsburg were still on. And heaven forbid, we got a Notre Dame person in there now. But so they are the elite. I mean, whether they're conservative or liberal, they're the elite. How more elite can you get than that? And like I said, they don't have to impress anybody but each other anymore. They're there forever. Nobody's probably going to impeach them. I mean, if they haven't impeached, somebody yet, it's not likely it's going to happen. And they're black and white, they're Hispanic and women and men, but they're all of an ilk that they would feel her above reproach, I suppose. And so it does go along that more justices become liberal as they're on the court, then become more conservative. It's a rare justice that has become more conservative since after being appointed to the court. Wizard White was probably one. He was a football star at Colorado and in the NFL, and Kennedy appointed him to the court, and he actually voted against Roe versus Wade, even though Henry Blackmun went the other way. I'm now talking a little too much inside baseball, so to speak. But in any case, the current Supreme Court, you could see John Roberts becoming slightly more liberal. He's of a mind, I think, that he's looking at his legacy much the way Marshall did. He's looking when he's dead, basically, and saying, I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. I don't really want Roe versus Wade to come before the court. That's going to be like a real, something's going to happen now that's going to be too much for me to bear. Certainly, gay rights is not going to come up again. I mean, that's not going to happen. I know people are worried about it, and I could see being, in the vanguard a bit, but it's not going to come before the Supreme Court because the current Chief Justice doesn't want it to be there. So you're going to have these business cases, that he'll certainly bring up, and you'll be conservative things. And I'm sure there's going to be some minor adjustments to Roe versus Wade, but essentially it's been overturned. I mean, look at all the state legislatures that basically, Arkansas just passed a bill that basically won't allow abortion except if the mother's dying. So, I wouldn't want to be a poor woman and living in Arkansas and wanting an abortion and not being able to get to Pennsylvania to get it. But suffice it to say, that's the way it is now, so no matter what the Supreme Court says.
Well, yeah, I think we'd probably also agree that Roberts has been instrumental in saving Obamacare twice. And there's some somewhat problematical case that pending before them now that Republican attorney generals put there, and they argued it in November. It's expected to survive that too. Obamacare has just been expanded by the American Rescue Plan. And it would seem to me that the last thing he wants also is to go down in history as the guy who presided over overall, something that killed off 20 to 30 million people's health insurance.
Right, right. And so that, I mean, so that there, the other thing that, the other case that is sort of fun or funny that Marshall presided over was the treason trial of Aaron Burr. Now, that was really the O.J. Simpson trial of the early 19th century. I mean, Andrew Jackson took a carriage from Tennessee to Virginia to see this case. I just saw that Inherit the Wind. Have you ever seen Inherit the Wind? It's the trial, and that was the same kind of thing. People came from all over to stand outside and talk about it. So Burr, after his he continued being vice president after he shot Hamilton, but then he was done. I mean, he couldn't run for anything anymore, and he went off and tried to conquer a certain way some part of the Western territories with other men, and he was brought back in chains to Virginia, which is where it started. So that's and Marshall comes and is the Chief Justice, and he presides over this trial. Well, of course, Jefferson wanted Burr to be put away forever. You know, he ruined his term by shooting Hamilton, even though Hamilton's the other party. And but of course, Marshall exonerates him because he says, in order to be convicted of treason, you have to have two people seeing acts of treason, and there was no verification of this in the treason trial, so he didn't sentence him to anything else. And Burr, he goes on, has a life, becomes a businessman. He actually does outlive Marshall
by a year, right?
But he's not an active founder, clearly, after his vice presidency is over.
Yeah. We have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to read a comment from somebody who's watching, and it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about before about slavery and history, and I think this in some ways dovetails with how we were trying to deal with it here in our discussion. But I'll invite you to comment on this one more time, Bob. I'll just read this. My only concern with the slavery issue is that in education, where we mention both accomplishments and slavery, that it seems like we don't accept the full gravity of what it meant to be a slave owner. I hope with discussions like these that we can begin to discuss the best ways to honestly depict each part of their lives.
It is true, because there are unanswerable questions. We have trivial unanswerable question: who's the best baseball player? Who's the cutest girl in your fifth grade class? That you can argue about. Now, I bring them up because this is a theoretical question. We're not living under slavery right now, at least not in the United States. I mean, there are clearly other countries that have issues that are quasi-slavery, if not real slavery. But so when we're living with a legacy, it's just very hard to come up with an easy answer. And all right, white supremacists and all this other crap. Well, all right, they're off to the side. But those of us who are not of that feeling can have a range of thoughts about what the past really means. And some, it's important to study the past, whatever the Santayana quote is, because it'll come back to bite you. But that's the serious end of what I like about history. And then there's these sort of sarcastic, or that whatever happened under Donald Trump certainly happened under John Adams. We sort of like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. They were vicious people. Jefferson picked people to write a Washington biography that was different than Marshall wrote the original biography. That was different than Marshall's biography. because he didn't see in Marshall's biography, he didn't see enough about good things about Thomas Jefferson in there. So, and they were personal. Back then, they actually knew each other, right? Well, we don't know any of them, but they all knew Washington, and they knew each other, and all the other ancillary guys. I also think the Constitution was settled in 4 months in Philadelphia, right? In secret. Madison kept notes, and his is the only notes that we go back to. And he said they can't see these notes until I die. So we don't know exactly what was said. And if we believe Madison, fine. But just think about how fast that is. How fast it is to get the rules for the country. I mean, they can't even decide on designated hitter after 30 years, So they come up with this country. And the only reason they come up with this country, I believe, is that Philadelphia was squashed in against the river. So all these people had to know each other every day. The water was terrible, so they drank a lot of liquor. So I don't know that they were drunk all the time, but they had like a breakfast beer, instead of the water because it was so bad. So they all sort of hung out with each other. And I remember when I worked at Channel 3, some nights I would come out, and it was on Independence Mall, and the lights would be shining a little bit, and I'd be walking home past Independence Hall, and I'm thinking very patriotic thoughts. And there are Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin walking down the street, and they see Caesar Rodney from Delaware. They say, "Caesar, great party last night. We'll see you tomorrow at the meetings," or whatever they would say. And that's how I feel the country sort of came together. It was like they were able to compromise because they were all, if not friends, at least, drinking buddies. And we were just sort of lucky. We lucked out that all these people came to Philadelphia at the right time in the right spirit. And they were all sort of literate. Even like Marshall, who didn't go to school, they all studied stuff. They were all sort of the same ilk, like upper middle class white men, and it has its bad points. They didn't deal with slavery very well in the Constitution, but they got it sort of together, and it's a pretty good document. And
well, they gave us enough to keep in fits and starts, helping us to improve 200 plus years later. So the last thing I want to ask before we ring off everybody who might be watching, so you've done Buchanan and Marshall. Do you have any thoughts about another?
Yeah, my next proposal,
making somebody else real.
Yeah, the next proposal, which I assume is going to happen. You only got to assume when your agent says it's going to happen. Is going to be a history. Long ago, I did a story for the Inquirer magazine on that Art Carey, who you remember, assigned me, and that was Cherry Hill, where I grew up, as a history of a place that has no history. But I became fascinated with it. I did all these oral histories, and so over the last 30 years, I've been collecting oral histories, and it'll be the basis of the history of the suburbs of the 50s and 60s, which I believe is sort of backwards from the way we feel. I feel like our parents were pioneers, much the same way as the pioneers who went across the country and stopped at a river in Wyoming and said, "We're stopping here, let's build our huts, let's build our housing developments and our fire company and our baseball fields and everything else that they built out there." So it'll be much lighter and but of that era. So I've done something in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and then hopefully I'll live long enough to do the next one after that.
Well, on behalf of whoever might be watching, I want to thank Bob for breathing life into history and making it live. So, any last words for anybody?
No, I think
my last words.
Yeah, I think you should study. I think people should study history in a certain way and look at it. I started helping some. Well, I won't get into this, but I just feel that I've had so much fun doing history after a lifetime of journalism, which was contemporary stuff, And going back to, like I say, all my father's books on Woodrow Wilson and whoever else is back behind me there.
Well, as William Faulkner said, I think it was, the past is not dead, it's not even past.
Past, yeah.
Well, all right, thanks everybody, and thank you, Bob. I'll ring off and hope everybody had a good time watching.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.